Hello and welcome to Hudson's County. I'm glad that you could join us again today for another TTRPG Talk. This series discusses tabletop role-playing games and related materials, makes suggestions for your own games, and takes a look at some of my own materials. Today will be a continuation of our SRD series, but things will be a little bit different this time. With Design Month 2023 rapidly approaching us, I will likely not have very much time to cover SRDs in the month of February. So in order to make that up for you, I decided that this episode would be a twofer. One SRD and one role-playing engine that you could use as the basis of a solo game, or integrate it as a mechanic into a GM-less system, or maybe like a GM assistance system. So let's start off with that SRD. It is ideal for solo games and uses cards. While that does sound a lot like the Carta system that we recently covered, Peregrine by Eliot Silvarian takes things in a slightly different direction. While Carta games are typically about filling out a map of some sort, Peregrine is a road trip. In fact, Peregrine's origin game is that of Village Witch. In that game, you play a witch who is wandering, attempting to find a home for themselves among a set of villages, each of which needs a witch to help and protect them. As you pass through the seasons of your wanderings over the course of a year, you use either a deck of playing cards or tarot cards in order to provide randomized prompts, which are accompanied by season-related descriptions and questions that help set the basis for that round's events. Eventually, the player comes to learn more about the wants and needs of their very witchy character, and hopefully, by the end of the gaming session, you have either found the character gravitating towards a particular village in order to stay, or continuing their journey on for another year. There is little in the actual realm of rules within the Peregrine SRD itself, beyond the basics of what I've described for which village. So if you do want a practical view of the rules in action, I would highly encourage you to pick up Witch Village itself, which does have community copies should you find yourself in need. Instead, what the SRD mainly contains is advice and prompting questions. How should you divide the passage of time in your Peregrine game? How detailed should you go with your descriptions versus leaving things to the player's imagination? This advice section finishes with some recommendations on how you might be able to also improve accessibility in your game, such as creating a text-only version, or encouraging you to potentially consider using the openDyslexic font. What about licenses and other resources? Well, Peregrine does come with two different logos in white, black, and gray, and you are given permission to further recolor them as necessary. The logo is copyrighted, but you are allowed to use it as long as you provide attribution and don't make any changes beyond, again, as I mentioned, changing potentially the color. The SRD itself can be used under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 license, and does include some handy text that you can just copy-paste into your legal page of your game text should you need to. Now, who would want to make a Peregrine game? Well, it is definitely useful for journeys, as I mentioned earlier. With some extra mechanics or flair, I could see this narrative-focused storytelling system allowing you to tell stories involving the passage of time, or physical journeys in a number of different genres, like calm slice-of-life wanderings, to Oregon Trail, or even like Train of Busan levels of potential danger. I think it would have been an interesting system actually to potentially integrate into my game Run Villain Run had it been out at the time. As usual, links to the SRD and the game Village Witch can be found in the description down below, but now we need to move on to the second half of this episode. The second thing we're going to be discussing today, it does not describe itself as an SRD, but rather calls itself a solo engine. Created by Graven Utterances, Recluse is a one-page that is mostly crunch in contrast to the Peregrine SRD. It can be used under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 license, so it is just as usable as most other systems that we have discussed here in our series as a part of one of your own games. What makes Recluse different from other solo or GM-agnostic systems? Well, Graven Utterances claims that they have attempted to create this engine to do two things. First is to make interpretation quick. All decisions are based entirely on a single roll of 2, maybe 3 dice, without needing to do any math or consulting of tables, just by comparing the values of the dice to one another. The second thing is that they were attempting to introduce a level of unpredictability that is not usually present in a lot of solo games or like GM emulator systems. Let's try to explain those 2 points by looking a bit deeper into the actual mechanics of the actual engine itself. The system is not that different from a lot of Oracle systems, but this one is built around 2 six-sided dice of different colors. One color is yes, the other color is no. Whichever die rolls a higher value is the answer to my binary question. So for example, let's say I ask the question, did John go to the store today? I roll my dice, and I get a 3 on my yes dice and a 1 on my no dice. Well, this means that yes, John went to the store, because obviously that was the higher value. If you want to add some more granularity or shades of gray to that answer, then they also encourage you to use and but statements. If both dice rolled have a value that is below the mean outcome for your dice, whichever value of dice you're using, then the answer is yes or no, but if you roll above the mean outcome of the dice, then the answer is yes or no, and so on and so forth. Since the mean outcome of a six-sided dice is 3.5, then this means that a 1, 2, or 3 would be a but, and a 4, 5, or 6 would be an and. Now remember, that's if both of the dice are a 1, 2, or 3, or both of the dice are a 4, 5, and 6. Going back to our previous example that I mentioned before, where we rolled a 1 and a 3, to the question of, did John go to the store today? Since we rolled a 1 and a 3, then that means we get our answer would be, yes, John went to the store, but, and then we can continue that by saying maybe the store didn't have what he was looking for. Or, yes, he went to the store, but what he wanted to buy was too expensive, so he couldn't. Right? Something has interfered with the success of whatever it was we're attempting to do, basically. We can also use this D6 system to play with the odds a bit. This can be done simply by adding an extra die to the side that we think is a bit more likely to be true, and then simply using the higher of the 2 dice that we roll for that value, which essentially, if you're familiar with certain RPGs like D&D or whatever, means basically we're rolling with advantage. Graven Utterances does mention that adding this extra die significantly skews the chances that you will get an and result rather than a but result. They kind of mention this as being more of a feature rather than a bug, encouraging the player to use it as a means of making the action or the outcome more extreme for dramatic effect in instances where success in a certain direction is more likely. If you would like to maintain that original balance, or if you want to be a bit less heavy-handed or brute force than adding a full d6 to one side or the other, you could also create a modification to this system that actually uses different sizes of dice rather than just adding that additional d6. This allows, again, as I mentioned, this allows you to introduce degrees of probability that are just not possible with just six-sided dice. So for example, you could take the d6 for yes and swap it out for a d8 or a d10. And this, of course, would have a smaller impact statistically than the odds of a 2d6 versus 1d6. I advise you, however, to dig a lot deeper into the maths yourself to see what kinds of combinations you think might work best to reflect the differences in probability, just to try to get a feel for what you feel will be worth it to include, or to kind of what do you think would feel best for the design of the game that you're creating. All of what we've discussed so far assumes that one color had a higher value than the other. So for example, R1 and R3. But what if we ended up rolling doubles? If this happens, then clearly there must have been some sort of misconception behind the original question. Some fundamental assumption behind the way that you viewed the scenario is flawed in a way that makes the question you're asking impossible. This is probably best explained for an example. So let's go back to our original question of did John go to the store? Let's say instead of rolling a 1 and a 3, I roll 2 threes. Instead of trying to answer the question, did John go to the store? I need to determine what about the world makes John going to the store right now an impossible thing to do. Maybe there are no brick or mortar stores in John's society because everything's ordered online and therefore he doesn't have a store to go to. Maybe everyone has Star Trek style replicators and no money, so shopping is not really a thing. This is a thing of the past, right? Maybe John can't leave his home. Maybe he's under house arrest, right? Maybe he can't get to the store because it's not physically possible for him to get there because there's an accident or there's a bridge out or, um, or maybe John isn't actually a physical person who can go places. Maybe John is actually a computer construct and therefore he cannot leave the computer to go to the store. There could be lots of different reasons that could very drastically shift your game's universe and give you an entirely different picture on the way this world works and operates. Part of the reason why to be able to do this would be essentially world building while you're creating your narrative. You could start off with an initial basic image of what you think this world looks like in your mind, but then things can change pretty drastically based on some of these random events that could end up occurring and making things a bit unpredictable. Now, where could you potentially utilize this type of an engine? To be perfectly honest, you could use it in almost any system you wanted to. While the Recluse does call itself a solo engine, you can never underestimate the power of mechanics or tools like this in a GM-agnostic GM-agnostic tables or games. Even if I was running a strong GM-guided campaign, like your standard stereotypical TTRPG where everybody's sitting around the table and you have a facilitator or a GM or a storyteller or something like that, I would actually encourage the use of sort of drop-in tutorial tools or oracle tools like this one for a couple of different reasons. One of the main ones would be to try to decrease the decision-making burden on the storyteller. Everybody ends up eventually suffering from decision fatigue. And obviously the GM is probably the person at the table who has to make the most decisions and remember the most things. So adding a tool like this would really help alleviate some of that. However, using an oracle tool like this also can integrate the players more into the narrative building through either allowing them to physically roll the dice or letting them determine the odds of ands or buts or yeses or nos, or even tweaking roll probabilities if we're utilizing multiple sizes of dice and stuff. Basically canvas the table, right? What do you think are the odds of this thing being true or not, or yes or no or whatever, right? Again, another way that players could really get pulled into this is if a player ends up rolling doubles, then you could have that player decide exactly why it is that this thing is not possible, right? Or you could have the table as a group sort of negotiate this out and figure out what's going on and the reason why a thing is not possible. You could utilize this a lot also to try to build out the capabilities of your NPCs, right? Like, so if one of your players asks, what does John look like? I mean, that's not a yes or no question, but you could very easily ask yourself a series, maybe have a short little series of pre-written questions to try to help determine, like, what does this person look like? What did they do? How do they present themselves, right? That could help build out some of those answers real quick as you're telling them, like, this person is, okay, they're tall and they've got, so I have a question. Are they tall? I roll. Yes, they're tall, right? Yes. Nice. Yeah, they're short for a giant, so they're still 8 foot tall, right? All of those things are definitely possible. And again, you can add granularity depending upon dice and stuff like that, or you could Even potentially by introducing additional dice, you could make this a multiple choice question. Have 3 or 4 options with like using a D12 instead of a D6 or something. Anything like that's possible. Um, Links to everything, as usual, can be found down below, and I definitely encourage you to check out both of these systems. I definitely think they're worth your time, and of course, also check out Village Witch. I have not really found a game yet that actually uses Recluse. If I do find one, I will include a link in the description down below. But if not, then check out Recluse and try using it in your own solo game. I very much doubt you'll be disappointed. Again, thank you all for joining me again today here on Hassens County, and don't forget to rate your itch purchases. If you would like to show your support for this channel or for the Hassens County blog, in the description down below you will find links to the channel coffee and also the itch store. Please feel free to take a look, and thank you for your support.